And I'm actually going to apologize at the beginning because I usually like to lead these roundtables in a much more kind of calm, measured, way. We have 30 minutes, and I'm going to feel like I'm going to bulldoze right through a lot of pleasantries. So forgive all the lack of ceremony. Sit down. Yes. All right. First, though, we need to reintroduce and introduce for the first time. Do we have? Good. So, Jeremy, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Jeremy Friedel. I'm a director of Trend Solutions at Express Scripts.
And, sorry, reintroduce yourself, just so everybody.
Gustavo Suarez. I'm the lead medical director for Novartis in the U.S.
Okay. So, Jeremy, all payers in the United States are going to cover this drug, right?
Yeah, they will.
They would have covered it no matter what the price was.
More or less, yes, definitely. I mean, it would have probably changed a bit of how they assess relapsing versus secondary progressive, but it would have been covered regardless of price.
Okay. So let me ask you a question that's actually not even about siponimod, but given what the FDA did, and believe me, we know we've had very good engagement with Novartis throughout the entire course of this review, with patients and the patient community. Nobody saw the FDA label coming the way that it did. And so it kind of made people step back and say, what just happened here? One thing that happened is that the FDA basically said for active SPMS, active SPMS, everything that we have in the toolbox is now indicated for that too, even though we didn't say it at that time. We said it was relapsing and remitting, and now we're saying active SPMS is a subset of RRMS, basically. So our payers now going to go back and change the coverage criteria for everything else out there for DMTs and say it's now also covered for active SPMS. What's going to happen with that piece of this?
So if I use the position that Express Scripts has had leading up to this point, we've actually provided coverage for the other medications for this particular subpopulation. So that won't really change. It'll just be more well-defined within our policies. What I think it does, though, it opens up the opportunity to start looking at could we create step therapy opportunities between siponimod and the drugs that have been around for a while. So since they're bringing, the FDA kind of brings them all together in one group, it may open up opportunities for us to kind of look at them from a step therapy perspective.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. So let's, I guess, move quickly to step therapy. We'll come back also from a clinical perspective, actually, first. So Annette, you've been a huge fan of siponimod's role in therapy. I think everybody caught that today. You were subtle, but it came through. It was mainly your body language, but so what is the role in therapy of siponimod? Is step therapy a good idea? Is it still a bad idea? Because, there are some conditions, and we hear this a lot about certain areas like multiple sclerosis, where it's really hard to know what's going to be the best drug for each individual patient, and there might be a million different personal or other kinds of clinical aspects. It would mean one drug might be the best drug to start with versus another. So we know that tension anytime an insurer starts to think about step therapy. From your clinical perspective, and Dr. Cohen, welcome yours afterwards, where do we go with step therapy with siponimod?
So I have posed that question to our group of MS specialists in Kaiser since December and to all of our neurology leaders. And the question I asked them, based on the evidence, and this is before seeing the shenanigans that occurred and the additional analyses in the FDA report, when would you use this drug? Think of a patient scenario when you would use this drug instead of anything else, everything else we have available to us on the market. And so far, no one can come up with a single scenario. I think step therapy, if done properly, does work very well for MS. We've had a published step therapy policy in Kaiser for, I think, over 5 years, 6 years now. I think the main issue really around that is that you have to allow people with highly active disease access to highly effective therapies immediately, not making them fail first. Within categories of drugs, we have highly effective therapy and modestly effective therapies, to which fingolimod and siponimod would technically make the highly effective definitions, siponimod primarily because it's so similar to fingolimod, for relapsing forms of MS. Within that, I think it's completely reasonable for insurance carrier weighing safety and price. So we say, effectiveness is first. If there's a drug in there that's clearly safer than others in that category, that should get priority, cost be aside. But if they're reasonably equivalent, I can give you the example of B-cell depleting therapy. For highly effective therapy, we primarily use rituximab, and JCV antibody negative natalizumab patients. Both those drugs work extremely well, and they're very safe. It's reasonable then for insurance carrier to say it should then and only then do we consider cost. Okay, right. So I think what the problem we run into in the real world, both insurance carriers and prescribing physicians, is that they don't put patients with highly active disease on highly effective therapies soon enough. The physicians do it. And the insurance carriers often create barriers. They get confused and think Tecfidera or dimethyl fumarate is a highly effective therapy and allow them access to that, but not to any of the drugs that have actually beaten active comparators. And so I think, it's a larger societal problem, and it's based on these sort of secret price negotiations where the pharmacy groups often will simply try and push the drug they got the cheapest price on. So I think there is a way to do rational step therapy. I don't see Simpanimod. I don't see us using it at all in Kaiser, just because no one can seem to think of a reason they would use it over fingolimod. And that drug in and of itself has become much less popular both here and in Europe over the last 5 years.
So what is the small group of DMTs in which Simpanimod now sits as co-equal in your mind if you're thinking about step therapy and you can get a cheaper price for one? It's reasonable from a clinical perspective to use A, B, C, or D.
Yes. So we have for years defined highly effective therapy as drugs that either showed evidence of clear superiority to an active comparator in a relapsing remitting trial or showed evidence of potency, so clearly hit multiple endpoints in a progressive patient population, which this drug would, of course, not count by that definition, but certainly Ocrevus does, or evidence of potency in that they tested it only in patients with highly active disease, and that would count for rituximab and alemtuzumab. Even though before their initial trials. All others go into the modestly effective category where they've been tested, many of them have been tested head-to-head against each other, and they were not able to demonstrate clear superiority. Simpanimod, it's an interesting call, right, because they didn't test it head-to-head to anything, but it does look essentially identical, both in terms of efficacy and safety, with the caveat of that genotype and the short half-life to fingolimod. So by our a priori criteria that a class effect, unless there's evidence to go otherwise, it would go into the same class with fingolimod, which did demonstrate superior over Avonex. So that is in the highly effective category.
Dr. Cohen, your view.
So let me make a couple of comments. First of all, in this particular population, the impact of relapses is much greater on disability than it is in an early relapsing remitting population. This partly has to do with brain reserve and nervous system ability to compensate for damage and so on and so forth. In the earlier populations, there's evidence accumulating, as Annette has alluded to, that in patients who are getting more potent therapies, the outcomes are better. So in this particular population, that becomes even more important. You really need an effective therapy in this group because every relapse adds to disability. And there is data to support that in the medical literature. In terms of where this drug falls, I agree. It falls similar to fingolimod. We have 3 active clinical trials that have shown superiority of fingolimod to either placebo or to interferon. So there is some evidence from those trials that can be generalized to this. So therefore, it becomes a more effective therapy, and the thought of step therapy, which involves injectable therapy, scares the hell out of me in this population, okay? But I also agree that there are more potent therapies out there for suppressing relapses. Ocrelizumab is certainly one. Rituximab is equivalent to ocrelizumab. Alemtuzumab is one as well.
So let me just make sure we all understand when you say scares the heck out of you, won't they have already been on, an interferon and now they're secondary progressive? You're not suggesting that people will make them circle back and try a different interferon or something else?
I don't know what they'll do. So it depends on the formulary obscurities and capriciousness that enters into this. And I can tell you that My experience with this in a relapsing population is that it's often capricious. So it is an issue, and it's a critical issue in this population. If you're treating a population that has secondary progressive disease and you're not using a highly effective therapy in that population, then you're undertreating them.
Okay. So capricious, Jeremy, they called your middle name, I think. What do you think? And obviously, I know that you work at one PBM, but try to reflect your knowledge of how other payers will view this and what kinds of variability clinicians and patients will be confronting with siponimod now entering the toolbox.
Yeah, so the focus of this review has really been on secondary progressive, which it really should be, since that's what makes the drug so novel and it introduces that conversation. But with the label and the FDA information, what we have to think of as payers is it doesn't just simply pull the other drugs into secondary progressive, but it has the potential to pull this drug back into relapsing remitting, where there are so many other drugs. Right. So to the point of step therapy, its effectiveness really will probably come into when prescribers choose this product maybe initially, when the patient hasn't used anything else before and they have a relapsing form. By the time they reach a true definition of secondary progressive, to the points that have been brought up, they probably have gone through multiple other agents. So at that point, step therapy becomes really far less effective, if effective at all, since they probably have already used multiple agents. Right. So I think step therapy would have to be done clinically first. All of our rules would be based that way. And then there would have to be some financial difference that makes it even worth doing. But I think the impact of it really has to do with this drug being pulled back down into the relapsing remitting patient population, not so much secondary progressive.
Okay. So some of the issues you were talking about clinical instinct or evidence suggesting earlier use of more effective treatments despite the risk profile. Yeah. Still, the payer community, at least parts of it, not pointing at you, payer community still, my understanding is that there are still cases where you might think you have a highly active patient that you want to start quickly on a higher effect drug, and you need to march through the other drugs first, correct? So this isn't going to create that problem, but it will be another situation. If it does get pulled into our consideration for some RRMS patients, that issue will still apply to different payers.
You've been on many other drugs.
Yeah.
They may not have been on many other drugs. They may have been on one other drug.
When they get to SPMS.
Right. And so if the tiering requires multiple other drugs, that's a problem.
Okay. Can I ask another question? That's very helpful. So I have in front of me a sheet of paper that, in font that's way too small, describes the coverage policies for ocrelizumab across about 6 different payers in the United States. 3 or 4 use step therapy, 2 don't. Some say you can use it in RRMS and PPMS, some don't. So my guess is that the clinical community and patients are going to continue to see a lot of variability when it comes to siponimod. One interesting variability is some of the policies say that the patients must be ambulatory for ocrelizumab. Most don't, but some do. Some of the major payers say that they have to be able to walk more than 5 meters and not be considered wheelchair bound. I noted indirectly, because I wasn't an expert in the detail of the data here, but is there a spectrum of patient severity that was tested for this drug that would suggest that payers should or should not consider whether it would be covered in patients who have become wheelchair bound?
So I think you have to consider this in the context of a clinical trial. In a clinical trial, you enter patients that are likely to show an endpoint that you can measure. That's how you select people to include in a clinical trial. That doesn't mean that the benefit that accrues in a clinical trial doesn't necessarily apply to individuals who don't qualify or are not entered into the clinical trial. You can't assume the mechanism of action would be different in those individuals. And so to go back to an earlier comment I made, one of the problems with this clinical trial is the fact that 56% of the people were at 6 or 6.5. Mm-hmm. Okay? If you want to look for change in an EDSS at 6 or 6.5, and your average length of time at that step on the EDSS is 3 years, and in order to get into the trial, you had to already have had a progression, you're not going to see it in 18 months, right? So, I mean, that's an issue with how they design the trial, right. But the point here is that to make the assumption that the only people that will benefit are the people that are highly selected for a clinical trial, which is going to occur in a defined period of time, and are selected in order for their likelihood to show the endpoint, isn't a fair translation into clinical practice.
Well, I'll note that. I will say if I were in the shoes of the payer community, I think they would say it's unfair to assume that it does work outside of the patient spectrum that was tested in the trial. So there's uncertainty about that, but I think that's where a lot of the tension occurs.
Yeah, let me take you back.
Sorry, can you press down on the buttons?
But let me take you back to, and just briefly, to the whole issue of applying evidence-based medicine. If you go back to David Sackett, who was, some would say, the father of evidence-based medicine, he wrote an editorial in the British Medical Journal in 1996, which is entitled "What Evidence-Based Medicine Is and What It Isn't." And what he specifically said it isn't is to require randomized controlled clinical trials for every application of treatment. Okay? He specifically pulled that out. What he said evidence-based medicine is to use the best available evidence to apply to the specific circumstances of an individual patient. And so in this case, I think if you have an agent that shows evidence in the disease state, trying to say that because they didn't test that subpopulation with that specific characteristic is asking too much.
Annetta, please.
Or a different interpretation of that what we're always talking about in MS, particularly in advanced progressive MS patients, is risk and benefit. And the risk is, getting lost here. Like I mentioned before, we have a lot of data from the entire country of Sweden and Kaiser showing that the more disabled they are, the more likely they are to get serious infections. Most of that is sepsis. Most of it is driven by urosepsis, and also somewhat by pneumonia. And that's happening predominantly in patients exposed to rituximab who have advanced disease. So I think it is, and we included walkers, so 6.5 and above. So I think, this is this problem of where we now get into a territory where they are purely slowly progressive, like Anne described her mother being, they're very advanced, and then putting them on potent immunosuppressions and landing them back in the hospital. I mean, there is a point where the risks will outweigh the benefits.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's unreasonable for them to deny Ocrevus in somebody who has got very advanced disease. There are, of course, always going to be a few caveats in there where there's going to be a patient who is still very young and also had a recent relapse or had a recent active scan. Typically what we do in practice is we label those patients as relapsing progressive, which is why what he alluded to before, they've always gotten coverage for everything.
So Jeremy, back to you then. Again, can you imagine whether your group or others will be looking at this question of whether there's a clinical severity? I mean, the way that doctors talk, they would talk about the disease having kind of burnt itself out. It's no longer inflammatory. It's something else. Siponimod probably isn't going to work. It's not been labeled for the non-active version. But you can be active and still be in a wheelchair. So I was struck by that, and I wondered whether you think there are functional parameters that should factor into the coverage for siponimod.
So I think that definition between active and non-active will be a big one that payers are going to have to address or not address in their If I look at Express Scripts today with the we have, we don't try to do anything beyond just asking the prescriber, is it active, secondary, progressive? We allow them to determine if that's the case. But I'm sure we will see others and we will see customs that will try to go and add an extra layer of review, if you will, to try to define that it truly is active, particularly when data like this is presented, looking at what the potential cost value assessment between active and non-active is. As people think about that, there will be a lot of questions if payers and particularly clients don't think the is specific to where the drug seems to have its most benefit. So today, we don't do anything additional in that space, but I think this will be a very big question payers will face is how aggressively do you try to define what is active and what is non-active?
Yeah. Patients must, by the way, just love this. Am I active? Am I not active? Am I progressing or not? Isn't it just ridiculous? It's bad. Yeah. I feel for groups where your lived experience is being reclassified and which drugs can and can't be used, and it all feels so divorced from.
Somebody doesn't understand the drug.
Am I right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. So let me reflect back to the clinical experts, and Holly, please feel free to jump in on this one too. Let's assume that there are reasonable payers, not evil, who are considering trying to take the FDA label and define it in a coverage policy, and that means they're going to say we are going to cover it for active but not for non-active. They can do that by either having a doctor tick a box. Some of them will say, are there tests that we should ask, or some other way to check the medical record to decide whether it's active or non-active? What seems clinically or in any other way kind of the right way to go? Feasible, reasonable? If a payer is going to do it, how would they operationalize it, I guess is one way I could put it. If they've decided we're going to exclude coverage for non-active SPMS because it's not part of the FDA label, how would they, other than just asking a doctor, and maybe that is still the best way, what else could they do?
I think this is the part that confuses me, because how can you look at a patient and say, I can guarantee you're not going to have a relapse, you're never going to have another MRI lesion, especially if that person is on an active treatment, which in our survey we found most people with SPMS are. Maybe they're well controlled, or maybe if they're not on a treatment, maybe they're just in a natural lull between relapses and MRI activity. So if that were my decision to make, I would be ultra conservative. I'd want to watch the person for a very long time before making that. But even then, I wouldn't be 100% positive that it couldn't happen in the future.
So could a payer say, I want 3 years documented, no relapses within a 3-year period before I'll call it non-active? Wait, did I do that right?
I mean, I think, I'm sorry, and I'm not super familiar with the trial data, but I believe there were people who were in the trial who had been deemed as not having a relapse in the years up to that trial, who then had a relapse in the trial. So, and they weren't on the drug, they were on placebo. Yeah. So, and some were on drug as well, but these people were not treated, and there were people who were treated, and they had a relapse. So, that's kind of evidence for you that can happen.
Right. So I can guess if I were not to focus on YouTube, but the clinical community in the U.S., they would say, stay away from trying to tell me what active and non-active is and let me choose whether this drug has the right risk-benefit ratio for this patient.
I think that's a mistake because most general neurologists don't understand the distinction themselves, and that those are the people doing the primary prescribing in the community. So I mean, they have a hard time distinguishing between SPMS and our relapsing remitting MS. I can't tell you how many times I've had patients come to see me like Anne, who say, so do I have SPMS? I'm like, well, yeah, you just told me you have SPMS. You said for the last 5 years, your walking's been getting worse slowly. So, but I can tell you in Kaiser, we have come to a consensus statement with the MS specialists, so we'll see how a health plan feels about this. But the consensus statement we have is that if they've had disease activity within the last 3 years, we're essentially going to highly, highly recommend that they be on a therapy. So we will call them, arm wrestle them, say, listen, I think there's still some benefit for you to be on an immunotherapy right now. If it's been within the last 5 years, then we would still offer it, but we would be open to a discussion if the patient's leaning more towards being on nothing. So I don't know if that helps. And we define it as a relapse or a new lesion on MRI.
Okay, but I guess the dark side of the force here, if you will, would be a payer saying, if it's been documented, if I don't see documentation of a relapse within the past 5 years, I'm not covering it because it's now non-active.
And MRI.
All right.
Okay. Now, what you'll run into in the real world is they may have not had an MRI for the last 8 years. So they could do an MRI now and see that there has been some disease progression. And we would count that as, yes, that's good enough, even if the last one wasn't technically within the 5 years, that 5-year time frame. Because remember, a lot of patients have really high copays for their MRIs, too, at this point.
Does it the fact that you're in Kaiser where you actually have patients for 5 years matter? I mean, I know that MS patients tend to stick with their clinicians, but they may still have to change insurers. So, and let me just kind of put that on the table, but also pivot to see if Dr. Cohen had any different thoughts about this active, non-active, and how health plans should or shouldn't try to define it.
Yeah, so that's a very difficult issue even for us to define.
Yeah.
But I think to take the position that most general neurologists are idiots and can't figure out what to do is probably not fair. Certainly not to be preferred over some folks sitting at a table who don't treat MS patients, deciding they're going to set up arbitrary rules based on some metric of what came out of a randomized trial that lasted a year or two, and then trying to figure out what's going to happen over a lifetime. So I think you have to trust the fact that most doctors are trying to do the best for their patients, that they're going to try and get the best thing for them. Now, in terms of what metrics we use, if now that people are on therapies, if you look at clinical trial rates of relapse rates on current therapies, they're on the order of about 0.2. That means they're only going to that even a relapsing patient's only going to have a relapse every 5 years. All right, you're not going to see a whole lot of relapses in this population. You're going to see some that break through, and then of course they're going to be changed to another therapy. You're going to see a certain accumulation of new MRI lesions, and so you can use that as a metric. But mostly what you're going to see is you're going to see relatively subtle changes that aren't reflected on an EDSS because of the limits of the EDSS, but that are reflecting a patient's daily activities, their quality of life, their endurance, their fatigability, all of these things which are metrics that you can elicit in a doctor-patient conversation, but that don't come out on any of these scales.
Okay, thanks. So about 5 minutes left. Two big questions. Holly, we don't have a great treatment yet for certainly non-active SPMS. What future research is needed when drug companies and others are trying to research the next potential drug in this area? What should they do differently, or what would you say they are starting to do this and we want them to continue doing more of this? Give guidance to the research community about what comes next as we continue to try to get better treatments.
A couple of things. So it's been brought up before that MS is a combination of an inflammatory disease and a neurodegenerative disease. And the treatments that we have right now address the inflammatory component. We're still trying to understand better the neurodegenerative side of the disease and to try to think about what might help there. So I think that's an important
Develop
area.
Outcome measures for
Outcome measures, as well as looking into the disease mechanisms
Okay.
and compounds that might address those. And then I think also, and kind of to go along with that, not just preventing disease, but repairing damage. And that's a much tougher lift, but is something that people with MS, they don't want to just be stable. They don't want to avoid continuing to progress, although that would certainly be a fantastic thing, but they want to improve their symptoms that they currently have. So I would urge more focus on that as well.
All right, thanks. Gustavo, you didn't think you were going to get out of this alive, did you?
I was rolling away right now.
So the FDA took you guys to the woodshed on that clinical trial development. I don't know if heads rolled or not, but it's clearly had a part in why the label didn't end up being what many people thought it might have been based on the publicly available information. And then the price surprised some people. The patient community, at least some organizations, were concerned that it didn't seem to be in the trend that Ocrevus started, where the launch prices were looking a little bit lower. Coming out at $88,000 seemed kind of like going back in time to when the launch prices just kept marching forward. I know this is not your job, and so it's fine for you to say not my job. But what happened? Was it the problem that the label ended up being smaller in terms of what you thought the revenue would be, so you felt like to get the targets you really were hoping for as an organization, the list price had to go higher? Or was a higher list price, in a sense, a precedent or a precedent to a bigger rebate to try to get better formulary kind of positioning, again, given the fact that the data weren't as strong in some ways as many people had hoped? Help us understand, because from patients' perspectives, they felt like their voice was starting to be heard kind of about the effects of the financial burden on patients and how it intersected also with the access that they were getting. So this didn't feel like a win for them in terms of the price.
Yeah, and I have to put my disclaimer again. You said I'm the medical person,
Right.
So I don't sell the pricing, of course. What we did discuss is how to put a fair price and to the value that the drug could bring to the table. And even though you said the FDA kind of took us by surprise, we still think that we are at least the only proven drug to be efficacious in an SPMS representative set of patients. And I think that plays a good role in the discussion. That would be my comment.
Okay. Thank you for being a good sport and at least letting us ask that question, even though I know it's a hard one. But it is a hard one because it reflects, a lot of the issues we've talked about today, including the fact that if I look at these lists of payer, coverage policies, they are intense, they vary, and this is all a reaction to the fact that the prices and costs for care have been continuing to escalate without many times having the price really relate clearly to the added benefit for patients. We're still waiting for the home runs that we can really reward, and to have the resources to do that, we need to be much more, I think, cautious with the pricing as we continue this journey. Yes?
I think there's something also here that, of course, everybody around the table knows, but that we probably can't do anything about, and that is that the prices we're talking about are mythical. That the net cost to the people who are actually purchasing these drugs are reduced. We don't have that information. It's not a transparent situation. But I think it's an important element that in part is driving the costs. And I think we need to think about a system in which the whole cost issue becomes more transparent so that these kinds of estimates can be much more reliable.
Yeah. Actually, we do have the ability to see net pricing in the U.S. market through a collaboration we have. And we also were able to benefit on one of our earlier reports from an Attorney General investigation in Massachusetts that showed that the net prices were going up in lockstep with the list prices. So we're not seeing the insulin situation where list prices but net prices are dropping further. It's really a lockstep situation in which many of the multiple sclerosis drugs on the market had doubled in price within about 5 to 7 years because of their march forward. So we hope we're into a future kind of landscape in which that won't keep happening. We need the resources to support future innovation, as we said, fair price, fair access, and future innovation. So I just wanted, on behalf of the entire CEPAC, to thank our roundtable members. You've provided unbelievably helpful insights from the patient perspective, the research perspective, the clinical perspective, and from the policymaker perspective. Thank you all. We won't go around and do our closing comments on this part of the meeting, but we'll do that at the end of the next policy roundtable. So now we're going to break for lunch, and I think for the public members, there are restaurants available in the hotel, or there's a cafeteria across the street. Members of the CEPAC will be back in the break room where we met this morning. Thank you. And for those of you watching via webcast, we'll start again at 1 o'clock.